Midnight on the supply platform. Corin Hale sits alone on an upturned crate. Doesn't move. Doesn't need to. The base around him is asleep, all of it. The hangar lights dim to a low amber hum, and in his hand there's a bracelet. Worn leather. A name etched into the clasp, the letters rubbed almost smooth from years of being turned over and over between two fingers. He doesn't say the name out loud. He never does. Because saying it makes it real in a way that just holding it doesn't. And he's spent 11 years learning the difference. Learning it the hard way, learning it at 3 a.m. on supply crates, just like this one. So he sits, and the bracelet sits in his palm. And somewhere past the perimeter fence, the wind moves through dry grass that isn't grass at all. Just something that looks like it from a distance, and he watches it bend. Cut to black. Part 1, 11 weeks earlier. The form had two columns. Column A, general labor support, translation, equipment hauling, manifest review. The kind of work Corin had done in 9 postings across 9 years. Quiet work, careful work, the work nobody noticed until it stopped happening. Column B, embedded unit liaison. He checked B. He didn't mean to. Which is the part nobody believes when he tells it later, because who checks the wrong box on a Commonwealth deployment form? Who does that except he did his pen drifting one line lower than it should have, while his mind was somewhere else entirely, somewhere with a name on a bracelet. And by the time he noticed the form was already in the processing queue, by the time he tried to fix it, the correction window had already closed. 72 hours. That's how long it took for the slip to come back with a unit designation stamped across the top in red ink, the kind of stamp applied with real force, the kind that means somebody wanted you to notice it. Vex Company, 4th Auxiliary Raider Battalion, all-female formation, non-human personnel only. He read it twice. He read it a third time just to be sure the words weren't going to rearrange themselves into something more reasonable. They didn't. The depot clerk had bronze-green skin and the flat permanent exhaustion of someone who processed 1,400 slips a week and had stopped expecting any of them to be interesting. He asked her about a correction process. She told him the window closed at 48 hours. He was at 72. Vex Company's been asking for a liaison 11 weeks, she said, not looking up. They go through them fast. He didn't ask what that meant. He had a guess, and the guess didn't need clarifying. So he packed his bag, boarded the transport rail. 20 minutes out from the main depot, the plateau rising up ahead of him, like something had taken a bite out of the cliff face, and decided to call it a military installation. The sky was pale and too bright for 6 in the morning, and Corin sat with his transit folio in his lap, and the stillness of a man who had spent 11 years making the best of situations he never chose. He thought briefly about the bracelet in his pocket. He thought about a lot of things briefly. That was the trick of it. You let the thought arrive, you let it sit for exactly as long as it needed, and then you put it away again before it could turn into something you couldn't carry into a new posting. The gate guard was a Cathari woman, 2 heads taller than him, blue-gray skin, a jaw built like she'd never once needed to ask twice for anything. She checked his documents, checked him, checked the documents again. "You're the liaison," she said. Flat, not quite a question. "I am." She didn't move right away. Held the stillness of someone deciding whether this was a problem or just unusual enough to be someone else's problem. Then she pressed her palm to the gate panel and it opened. "Commanders in Block C," she said. "Mind the live fire corridors. Not always marked." "Appreciated," he walked in. The base unfolded the way good military installations always did. Organized chaos, the kind that looked like disorder until you understood the logic underneath it. Equipment racks in clean rows. Weapon stations, several occupied by women moving with the economy of people who'd done the same task 10,000 times and stopped wasting motion on it years ago. A sparring pit near the south wall, padding worn down to the frame. And every single woman who saw him stopped. Not hostile, just assessing. The way you'd look at something that wasn't supposed to be where it was, deciding which category it belonged to. He kept walking. Same pace. Neither faster nor slower. He'd learned that trick on a transit station with 9 species crammed into a hull built for 5. Learned it before he was 20. The moment you sped up, you were performing fear. And performing fear was worse than feeling it. Commander Severin Call was writing something when he reached her doorway. Physically writing. Stylus on slate, which struck him as worth noting because handwriting on a data slate wasn't efficient. It was a choice, and choices told you things efficiency never could. She didn't look up for several seconds. Blue-gray skin, dark hair cropped close on one side, left longer on the other. A scar running from her ear to her jaw, clean-edged the geometry of a blade, and not an accident. When she finally looked up, her eyes were amber gold, and they assessed him the way the others had, except faster, deeper. Like she'd done this calibration more times than anyone else on the base. Corin Hale, she said. Commonwealth Auxiliary Liaison Grade 2. That's correct. You're aware this is an all-female formation. I became aware about 72 hours after the correction window closed. A fractional movement at the corner of her mouth contained immediately, gone before it could become anything. The last 3 liaisons requested reassignment in their first week, she said. The one before that filed a formal complaint about the training schedule. What happened to the complaint? Unclear. We haven't had a liaison since. It might still be processing. He set his bag down. Precise. Out of the way. Commander, I checked the wrong box on a form. I'm past the correction window. I can request reassignment if you'd rather not have a civilian male in your unit structure, and I won't take it personally. Or I can do the job I was sent to do. Manifest review, translation support, logistics coordination. A pause. Either is fine with me. He meant both halves of that equally. Maybe that's why it landed the way it did, not a challenge, not a plea. Just 2 options held flat on the table. Severin Kull looked at him a beat longer than the conversation strictly required. Block D, she said finally. Second door on the left, briefings at 0730. Thank you, Commander. Don't thank me yet. She went back to her slate. The briefing room held 14 combat personnel and 1 commander, and Corin walked into all of them at once for the first time. Every woman in the room turned to look, held the look, ran their threat assessment on a Grade 2 logistics coordinator from the Commonwealth Civilian Auxiliary, and he found a seat at the far end of the table and waited it out. This is Corin Hale, Severin said. She didn't elaborate, didn't explain his gender, his species, his reason for being there. Just named him and moved into the resupply briefing, and he found that professionally extremely efficient. 3 transit vehicles, rerouted because of weather. His job, verify the manifest fix a documentation discrepancy from the last shipment. Simple work. He'd done it 100 times. What wasn't simple was the woman across the table, violet black hair, a horizontal scar across one cheekbone, watching him the way you'd watch a puzzle you hadn't decided was worth solving. She didn't say a word during the briefing, didn't look away from him for more than 30 seconds at a stretch. Her name was Drenna Voy. After the briefing, she crossed to his end of the table. You are not military, she said. No, civilian logistics. The others were civilian too. They didn't stay. I heard. You are not concerned. It wasn't quite a question. He answered anyway. I'm concerned about the manifest discrepancy. Because discrepancies usually mean something got misrouted and someone downstream is short a piece of equipment they needed. That one I can fix. The rest I'll figure out as I go. Drenna looked at him a second longer. Then she walked off without another word. He noted that as a neutral outcome and went to find the coordination channel. The discrepancy was worse than the summary suggested. It usually was. 3 line items from the last shipment had been logged under the wrong unit designation. Equipment meant for Vex Company had been absorbed into a depot pool rotation and scattered across 4 other units on the plateau. He spent 4 hours working through 3 levels of depot administration before a name surfaced that he didn't recognize yet, wouldn't recognize for weeks, a shift supervisor named Hask Varen, Mid-level, mostly invisible, the kind of name that exists in paperwork the way a watermark exists in paper. You only see it when you hold the page up to the light. He didn't hold it up to the light yet. He just submitted the retrieval request and moved on. He was still on the channel at 1:30 when someone set a food container on the table beside him. He looked up. A young Cathari woman, bronze-gray skin, pale eyes, the expression of someone who'd done something she wasn't entirely sure she needed to do. "You missed the midday meal," she said. "In this unit, you eat at unit time." "I didn't know that was the rule." "It is not a rule." A pause. "It is just how it works." She left before he could answer. He opened the container. Warm. Smelled better than he expected. He ate it between channel calls, and by late afternoon he located all 3 misrouted items and submitted the retrieval authorization. He went to the evening meal at unit time. The women of Vex Company filled a long table. There was a gap at the end. He sat in it. Nobody told him to move. By the third day, he'd learned 3 things. First, the unit ran at a pace with almost no slack, and what slack existed went to maintenance weapons review training. Nothing wasted. The previous liaisons had apparently found that oppressive. He found it comfortable. Structure was the thing that made work possible, and he'd always liked structure the way some men like silence. Second, the unit's opinion of humans sat somewhere between bemused skepticism and frank disbelief, and none of it was personal. It was professional assessment, the kind a senior surgeon runs on a first-year resident. Not dismissal, evaluation against a known standard. Third, the young woman who'd brought him food was named Tessa Wren, youngest in the unit by several years, responsible for internal comms, which overlapped with logistics, which meant they worked adjacent channels most of the day. She'd stopped avoiding him by day 2, started asking questions by day 3, listened to every answer with total attention, then asked the follow-up that proved she'd actually understood it. He found her professionally impressive. Drenavoy was still watching, not constantly, not obviously. The way someone watches when they haven't made up their mind yet, and they're still gathering data. He noted it, did his job. The resupply ran on day 5 and went wrong the specific localized way these things go wrong when weather's involved. 2 of the 3 transit vehicles unloaded fine. The third had a stress fracture in the rear cargo seal, and the crates inside had shifted during transit. Technically stable. Technically stable and actually stable are 2 different sentences, and Corin had learned that difference the hard way more than once in more than one posting. "Hold the unload," he told the driver. "Might be fine," the driver said. The thing people say when they want someone else to make the call. "Might be," Corin agreed. "Might also be 300,000 marks of calibration gear on the loading bay floor." He climbed into the cargo bay. Took 4 minutes to assess. The fracture had propagated further than it looked from outside. The crates needed manual resecuring before the vehicle could move. When he climbed back out, 4 of the Vex Company women were standing nearby, watching, not helping, watching. "Seal fracture," he said. "Crates need to be resecured by hand before we unload." Nobody said anything. He went back in. 20 minutes of awkward leverage, 300-kilo crates, cargo straps, one undersized depot worker who wasn't built for this kind of work and didn't pretend otherwise. By the time he climbed out again, there were 8 women watching instead of 4, and he hadn't noticed the extra 4 arrive. "Manifest says we're complete when the bay clears," he said to no one in particular, because he needed to say something, and that was the only useful thing available. Drenna stepped forward. She moved differently than the others, not faster, not louder, just with the economy of someone for whom the body was a precision instrument and every motion a decision. "You knew the cargo value precisely," she said, without checking his folio. "I review manifest before operations. It's standard." "You knew the crate weight?" "Estimated, based on packing density for that equipment class. I was within 20 kilos. Her expression shifted, not the puzzle tilt from the briefing room. Something that read more like a piece settling into its correct position. "The last liaison called for a full depot recovery team on a comparable incident," she said. Delay the operation 6 hours. That's also a valid approach. Why didn't you take it? Because the fracture was propagating slowly. The crates were stable enough to resecure by hand, and calling a recovery team on a weather-constrained day risked missing the transit window entirely. The math favored doing it ourselves. A pause. Also, I've worked with that vehicle model before. Drenna was quiet in the thorough way, the kind that processes rather than waits. You have worked with that chassis, she said, half question, half statement. Survey run a few years back. She stood a second longer, then walked back toward the others without another word. Corin logged the completion at 1714, submitted the report. He didn't know yet that someone in the depot administration office had read that same report and circled Hask Varen's name twice in red. He'd find out later. Everyone finds out later. That's how the worst things always arrive quietly in someone else's paperwork, weeks before anybody says them out loud. That evening, the gap at the mess table was smaller. Nobody made a production of it. The unit filled the table the way it always did, and when the filling happened, the gap happened to close. He listened to conversation he couldn't follow, yet the unit's internal shorthand, built from years of shared experience, the kind of language you don't get handed, you earn by being present long enough to collect the references. He'd always been that way about language, never asked for a translation, waited until context built the meaning, and then the word belonged to him in a way it never would have if someone had just given it to him. After the meal, Tessa found him in the comms block like she usually did now. You don't seem bothered, she said, by the unit watching you. He thought about it honestly. That was the only way he thought about anything. I grew up on a transit station. 9 species, 800 people, space built for 500. You learn fast that the thing to do when people are figuring you out is to keep being yourself long enough for them to get accurate data. Tessa considered that. That is different, as she said, from how most humans respond to the unit. The previous liaisons found the attention uncomfortable. They performed instead of doing the work. And then the watching gets heavier because now we're watching the performance, not the person. The gap gets bigger. And eventually they leave. And I'm not performing. You fix cargo seals and file depot reports, she said. You've done the same job the same way since you arrived. You do not adjust depending on who's in the room. I mostly don't notice who's in the room when I'm working, he said. It's not a strategy. A pause. Focus on the thing in front of me. Tessa looked at him with something quieter than the assessing look. That is rare, she said. Day 8, the sparring area incident. He wasn't meant to be there. Cutting through to the equipment block, his usual route blocked by a maintenance crew, the alternate path skirting the edge of the impact padding. He heard the problem before he saw it. A weight landing badly, breath catching wrong, the sound of controlled movement turning uncontrolled. Drenna was down. Not the intentional kind of down ankle at a bad angle, the joint announcing itself in the loudest possible terms. Upright, technically sitting, her face holding the very controlled expression of someone managing real pain through pure will. The others had stopped. Not panicked, not indifferent. Calibrated stillness, waiting to see whether she'd want help or want to handle it herself. She hadn't signaled either direction yet. Corin crossed the padding. Crouched. Can I look at it? Drenna looked at him. The assessment looked sharpened now by pain. You have medical training. Enough for field assessment. I'm not a medic, but I can tell you if you need one. A long beat. Then she shifted her leg. An extension of trust, or at least provisional tolerance. He assessed the ankle with the careful efficiency of a man who'd done this more times than he liked to count. Cathari anatomy wasn't human anatomy, but the structural principles were close enough, and he'd studied the differences his first week, because that was the kind of thing you did when you arrived somewhere new and didn't know yet what kind of help you might be asked to give. Not broken, he said. Strain on the lateral ligaments. Ice and compression for 40 minutes. No full weight today. Have the unit medic confirm, but that's my read. He sat back. Drenna regarded him with a new layer in her expression that he didn't have a word for yet. "You're not going to tell me to stop training," she said. "That's not my decision." A silence moved through the sparring area, different from the silences before it. He couldn't define the shift exactly. The attention had changed. Registers moved from the assessing quality he'd experienced since day one towards something else he didn't yet have a clean name for. He went and got the ice pack, brought it back, handed it over with a compression wrap from the supply kit. Then he continued to the equipment block. 3 minutes late for his next call, noted the delay, and kept moving. He found out from Tessa later that his assessment had been right, confirmed by the unit medic, and that Drenna's opinion carried more weight in this company than almost anyone else's. "What does she think?" he asked. Tessa considered the question. "She has not said directly," she said, "but she is no longer watching you the way she was." He held that without acting on it and went back to work. It was the 11th night that the bracelet came out again. Late, the hangar lights dimmed to amber. He sat on the same kind of crate he'd sit on weeks from now, in a future he hadn't reached yet, and turned the worn leather over in his palm. He hadn't told anyone here, not Tessa, not the commander, not even himself, not really, not in the way that meant actually looking at it. 8 years a combat medic. One mission that ended the way the worst ones always end, too late, too far. A name he still couldn't say out loud without something in his chest folding in on itself. He traded the field for logistics after that. Quiet work, paperwork, the kind of job where nobody bled out in front of you because you didn't reach them in time. And now he was here, in a unit that bled sometimes the way combat units do, small wounds, sprained ankles, the occasional sparring injury. Close enough to remind him, far enough that he could still hold it together. He put the bracelet back in his pocket. Somewhere across the base, a shift supervisor named Hask Varen was filing a report that didn't match the one Corin had filed 3 days earlier. The numbers were close, not identical. The kind of discrepancy that meant nothing to anyone who wasn't looking for it. Corin wasn't looking for it. Not yet. He went to bed instead, and the base went quiet around him, and the wind moved through the dry grass past the perimeter fence the way it always did. The way it would on the night 11 weeks from now, when he'd sit on a different crate with the same bracelet and the same silence. Except by then, everything around him would have already changed, and he wouldn't have noticed the exact moment it started. This was that moment. He just didn't know it yet. Day 14. The morning the discrepancy stopped looking like a discrepancy. Corin had a habit, had carried it through 9 postings, through 9 years of paperwork in places that didn't always want him reading it that closely. He cross-checked, not because anyone asked him to, because numbers that didn't match told you things people wouldn't. The retrieval report on the 3 misrouted crates had come back signed by Hask Varen. Standard procedure. Except the weight listed on the retrieval form didn't match the weight Corin had logged on arrival, and it didn't match by a margin too small to be a typo and too large to be rounding. 11 kilos. He sat with that number for a long moment in the comms block, the morning light flat and white through the narrow window. 11 kilos of calibration-grade equipment didn't just evaporate between a depot shelf and a transit manifest. It went somewhere. And somewhere in Corin's experience usually had a name attached to it eventually, if you were patient enough to wait for the name to surface on its own. He didn't go to Severin with it yet. Not with 11 kilos and a hunch. He'd learned that lesson in his second posting: bring half a problem to a commander, and you waste both her time and your own credibility. Bring a whole problem or don't bring it at all. So he noted the discrepancy quietly, cross-referenced it against the shift logs for that retrieval window. Found Varen's name on 3 other transactions in the same month, all small, all just inside the margin where nobody would notice unless they were already looking. He made a note in his working file under the heading "Things that are always useful in continued working." The same heading he'd used for a regulation number weeks before, except this note sat heavier, the way certain notes do before you understand why. Tessa caught him at it that afternoon. Leaned over his shoulder in the comms block, the easy familiarity of someone who'd stopped asking permission to be curious around him. "You've been on that ledger for 3 hours," she said. "Cross-checking a discrepancy. The crate waits. He looked up. She'd noticed. Of course she'd noticed. She noticed everything. Eventually, that was the thing about Tessa. The thing that made her good at comms and made her dangerous to keep secrets from. 11 kilos missing across 3 transactions, he said. Same shift supervisor on all 3. Tessa went very still. Ask Varen, she said. You know him. Everyone in logistics knows him. He processes most of the Southern Depot transfers. A pause, careful. He was also processing transfers during the 11 weeks the unit had no liaison. Before you. Corin sat with that. Nobody was cross-checking his numbers for 11 weeks, he said slowly. No. And now somebody is. Tessa didn't answer that directly. She didn't need to. The silence did the work, instead the kind that meant she understood exactly what he was implying and didn't love the shape of it either. You should tell the commander, she said finally. Not yet. Not with this. I need more than a margin of error in a name that shows up too often. And if you wait too long, he didn't have a clean answer for that. He held the question open, kept working, let the next few days tell him what it actually needed. That evening brought the second incident. Though it didn't start in the sparring area at all, it started in the equipment block where Tessa was running a routine inventory check and found a maintenance seal on a rifle rack that didn't match the seal logged in the morning report. Small thing, the kind that meant nothing on its own. Except Corin had spent 14 days learning that nothing on this base happened entirely on its own anymore. Not since the number 11 had attached itself to a name. He went to look at the seal himself. Drenna was already there, favoring her ankle slightly 3 days out from the sprain, but moving on it again because that was who she was. She had the seal in her hand, turning it over. This was replaced, she said. Flat. Not damaged, replaced. When was the last full equipment audit before you arrived? 11 weeks ago. The number sat between them. Someone's had access to this rack for 11 weeks without anyone checking it closely, Corin said. Drenna looked at him. The assessment look, except sharper, now aimed past him at something larger than whether one civilian liaison was competent. You think this connects to your discrepancy, she said. Not a question. I don't know yet. I think it's worth not assuming it doesn't. She held the seal a moment longer, then handed it to him. Log it, she said, and tell Severin. Tonight, not tomorrow. I was going to wait until I had... You have enough, Drenna said. 11 kilos. A name that shouldn't be on 3 transactions. A seal swapped during the exact window. Nobody was watching this unit closely. That is not nothing, Corin. That is a pattern. And patterns do not wait politely for you to be certain. It was the first time she'd used his name. He noticed it, said nothing, said all right. Severin was at her desk when he knocked. Late hour, the running light shifted from amber to the cooler blue-white. That meant the working day was technically over, except commanders didn't really have an off hour. Not in any unit worth its name. She looked up, read something in his face before he said a word. Sit, she said. He laid it out the way he'd laid out every problem in 9 years of postings, plainly in order without padding it, to make himself more comfortable saying it. The 11 kilos, the 3 transactions. Hask Varen's name appearing exactly where it shouldn't exactly as often as a careful man might allow himself to take without anyone noticing. The maintenance seal swapped during the same 11-week window the unit had operated without anyone checking the numbers. Severin listened without interrupting. That was its own kind of information. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Not empty, heavy with calculation. 11 weeks, she said finally. No liaison, no one cross-checking. And then you arrive, and within 14 days, you found a pattern that should have taken a formal audit team a month to surface. I wasn't looking for a pattern. I was just checking my own paperwork. That is precisely the point, Corin. She said his name the same plain way Drenna had, not warmth, just acknowledgement that he'd earned being addressed directly. A man who checks his own paperwork that carefully is exactly the kind of liaison someone like Varen would want reassigned within the first week, the way the last 3 were. The thought landed somewhere behind his ribs, cold and slow. You think the previous liaison's leaving wasn't only about the unit, he said. I think, Severin said, that I do not yet know what I think. But I know that 11 kilos in a swap seal are not a coincidence, sitting next to a pattern of liaisons who don't last. And I know you are the first who stayed long enough and looked closely enough to find either. She set down her slate. I am filing this through formal channels in the morning. Quietly. Varen reports up through depot administration, and depot administration does not respond well to accusations from a unit they already consider difficult. We need more than a margin of error before we move openly. Understood. In the meantime, her amber gold eyes held his steady. You will keep doing exactly what you have been doing. Your job. Nothing more. Nothing performative. If someone is watching this unit closely enough to exploit an 11-week gap, they are watching closely enough to notice if our liaison suddenly starts behaving like an investigator instead of a logistics officer. I wasn't planning to. I know, she said. That is why I am telling you, not warning you. He stood to leave. At the door, her voice caught him. Corin. He turned. The unit does not yet know what you found tonight, she said. I would prefer to keep it that way until we have more than a pattern. Can I trust that? It wasn't really a question the way most things she said weren't really questions. He answered like one anyway because that felt right for trust that hadn't been offered to him lightly. Yes, Commander, he said, you can. He didn't sleep well that night. Lay in the narrow bunk in Block D with the bracelet in his hand again. The worn leather warm from his own skin, the name under his thumb. He thought about 11 weeks of nobody watching. He thought about 3 liaisons who'd left before they could have found what he'd found. He thought briefly and against his own better judgment about whether their leaving had been entirely their own choice or whether something had made the choice easier to reach for than it should have been. He didn't have proof of that, not yet. But he had learned across 9 postings in 9 years that the absence of proof wasn't the same thing as the absence of a problem. Sometimes it just meant the problem hadn't finished showing itself. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass past the perimeter fence, indifferent to whatever was unfolding inside the base it surrounded. He closed his hand around the bracelet, closed his eyes. Tomorrow would bring the morning briefing, the unit still unaware. Severin carrying a secret she'd chosen to share with exactly one person outside her own command structure. And Corin doing the only thing he knew how to do with a problem this size. Keep working. Keep watching. Wait for the pattern to finish becoming a fact. Day 18 brought the thing he hadn't planned for. It started ordinary. A routine call with the depot coordination office about a supply timetable. Nothing connected to Varen, nothing connected to the 11 kilos. Except halfway through the call, the coordinator on the other end, a tired-voiced man named Olin Das, mentioned almost as an aside that the Southern Depot had flagged an internal audit request for unrelated administrative reasons, and that all liaison cross-checks from Vex Company would need to be routed through a different office until further notice. Corin sat very still. Whose request was that, he asked. Careful, even. Came down from depot administration, above my level. Does it have a name attached? A pause on the other end, the kind that told you more than the words that eventually followed it. I'm not supposed to say. I understand, Corin said. Thank you for telling me what you could. He ended the call, sat with the silence of the comms block around him, the morning light flat against the narrow window, and understood in the cold way you understand things that confirm a fear you hadn't said out loud yet, that someone had noticed him noticing. 18 days. That was how long it had taken. The previous liaisons had lasted 4 days a week less. He'd lasted 18, and he'd found the pattern, and now the pattern had found out that he'd found it. He went to find Severin. She wasn't in her office. He found her instead in the planning room alone, looking at the wide terrain map pinned to the wall, the plateau, the southern approach, the gullies he hadn't walked yet. They've rerouted our cross-checks, he said. No preamble. She taught him that she preferred problems delivered whole and fast. Depot administration above Olindasa's level. No name attached. As of this morning. Severin didn't turn from the map right away. 18 days, she said. I know. That is faster than I expected them to notice. Them, not him, not Varen alone. Corin felt something settle in his chest, not fear exactly. The clarity that arrives when a suspicion finally has enough weight to stop being a suspicion. You think it's bigger than one supervisor? He said. Severin turned then. Her amber gold eyes held the urgency she never expressed loudly. I think, she said, that a single-shift supervisor skimming 11 kilos off a depot transfer does not have the authority to reroute formal cross-check requests above another officer's head within 4 days of being flagged. That requires someone with rank, someone who can make administrative decisions disappear into routine paperwork. A pause. Someone who has likely been doing exactly that for considerably longer than 11 weeks. Outside through the planning room's narrow window, the plateau stretched pale and indifferent in the morning light, the same light it had held on his first day here before any of this had a shape. It is possible, Severin said, that it is exactly what it looks like. One supervisor careless, counting on nobody staying long enough to notice. Administrative carelessness, wearing the shape of something worse, because we are both tired enough tonight to look for shapes. He held on to that thought. It was the more reasonable one, the kind of explanation that didn't ask him to carry anything heavier than a logistics error. You don't believe that, he said. I believe, Severin said, that I do not yet have enough to believe anything with confidence, which is its own kind of answer and not a comfortable one. She looked at him a long moment. You're tired, she said, not unkindly, an observation flat accurate offered without ceremony. It's late. That isn't what I meant. He didn't answer right away. The planning room held its quiet around them, and somewhere behind his sternum, the old familiar weight shifted the one that had nothing to do with Varen or the 11 kilos or any of it. The weight that had been there since a mission 8 years ago that he still hadn't found the right words for. I had a posting once, he said, finally the words arriving slower than he meant them to, where I missed something I shouldn't have missed. Cost someone everything it could cost. I've spent 8 years making sure I never miss anything again. Sometimes that means I find things that are real. A pause. Sometimes it means I find shapes in nothing because some part of me is still convinced that if I just look hard enough this time, I'll catch it in time. Severin was quiet for a long moment. That is not nothing, Corin, she said. That is a man who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just told someone else about it for the first time tonight. Her voice didn't soften exactly. It wasn't in her to soften, not really, but something in it widened made room. We will not solve the 11 kilos tonight, and we will not solve 8 years tonight either. But you do not need to carry either one entirely by yourself anymore. Not in this unit. He hadn't expected that. Hadn't expected to say what he'd said, hadn't expected the answer that came back to him in its place. He looked at her, the scar along her jaw, the amber gold eyes holding something he hadn't yet learned the name for, and felt for the first time since arriving on this base. Something in his chest loosened by a fraction it hadn't loosened in 8 years. Thank you, Commander, he said. It came out quieter than he meant it to. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow we bring in Drenna and Tessa. Quietly. Whatever this turns out to be, carelessness or something worse, the unit deserves to face it together, not learn about it after the fact from someone like Varen. He nodded, turned to leave. Corin. He stopped at the door. Whatever is in that bracelet you keep turning over at night, Severin said, and he froze because he hadn't told her, hadn't told anyone. You do not have to explain it to me, not tonight, not ever if you'd rather not. But I have noticed you the same way the unit has noticed you. And noticing does not stop at competence. He didn't trust his voice for a moment, so he just nodded again and let himself out into the cooling night air. and stood for a long moment outside the planning room, with the base quiet around him and the wind moving through the dry grass past the perimeter fence. He thought about the 11 kilos. He thought less than before about Hask Varen and whoever might or might not be standing behind him. Mostly for the first time in a long while, he thought about the fact that someone here had noticed the weight he carried and hadn't asked him to put it down and hadn't looked away from it either. That was new. He went back to Block D, lay in the narrow bunk with the bracelet in his hand, and for the first time in 11 years, he didn't need to hold it quite so tightly to remember why it mattered. Tomorrow would bring the morning briefing and Drenna and Tessa, and whatever the unit decided to do together with a problem that was no longer his alone to carry. He closed his eyes. Outside, the wind kept moving indifferent and constant, the way it always had been, the way it would be on the night 11 weeks from now, when this story finished circling back to where it started. Part 2. 3 days had passed since the night in the planning room. 3 days since Severin had asked him plainly about the bracelet and let him answer or not answer as he chose. 3 days since he'd walked back to Block D with something in his chest loosened by a fraction. It hadn't loosened in 8 years and lain in his bunk, turning the leather cord over and over the way he always did, except slower this time. Less like a man gripping the only solid thing in a room that was collapsing. More like a man simply holding something that mattered because it mattered not, because letting go of it for even a moment felt dangerous. He hadn't told anyone else, hadn't planned to, not yet. Some things take their own time arriving at the people who need to hear them. You couldn't force the timing any more than you could force a wound to close before it was ready. You could only stay present for it and let it happen when it happened. And trust, though, trust didn't come easily to a man who'd spent 8 years measuring 4 minutes 1,000 different ways that the unit around him would hold whatever arrived with the same steadiness it had held everything else. He didn't know yet how right that trust would turn out to be. Day 22. The bracelet slipped. It happened the way small things always happen. Not during a crisis, not during anything that mattered on paper, just during an ordinary equipment handoff in the logistics block. Corin reached into his jacket pocket for a stylus, and the leather cord came with it caught on the seam, fell and landed on the floor between him and Tessa Wren with a sound too small to be the sound of everything changing. Except it was. She picked it up before he could, because that's who Tessa was. Quick hands, quicker eyes, the kind of person who noticed a dropped object before her own mind had finished registering it as worth noticing. She turned it over, read the name, went still in a way he'd never seen her go still before. Corin, she said, slow, careful, the way you'd hold something that might shatter if you breathe wrong near it. Who is this? He didn't answer right away, because there wasn't a short version. There had never been a short version, not in 8 years, not once. And the longer he stood there with his hand half extended and his mouth not working, the more the silence said things he wasn't ready to say out loud. Give it back, he said finally, quiet, not sharp, just tired in a way that went deeper than the hour. Tessa held it a moment longer, looked at the name, looked at him. Then she set it gently in his open palm, the way you'd return something fragile to someone who'd been carrying it a long time without ever setting it down. You don't have to tell me, she said, but I am not going to pretend I didn't see it. He closed his fingers around the leather. I know, he said. She went back to her console then, back to the comms queue, back to the ordinary rhythm of the afternoon as if nothing had happened at all, except something had. Because for 8 years, the bracelet had been the one thing entirely his, the one piece of the world he hadn't handed to anyone, hadn't explained, hadn't let become someone else's, to carry even partially. And now in the space of one dropped object and 4 seconds of silence, it had stopped being only his. He wasn't sure yet whether that frightened him or steadied him. Possibly both. Possibly that was simply what it felt like the first time in a long while to let someone see something before you decided you were ready. That evening at the mess table, Tessa sat across from him instead of beside him, which he noticed immediately because he noticed almost everything about this unit by now. The way you notice the furniture in a house you've finally started to live in instead of just occupying. She didn't bring it up. Didn't look at him with pity or curiosity or any of the expressions he'd half-braced himself for. Just talked the way she always talked about a comms routing problem she'd been wrestling with for 2 days, and asked his opinion the way she always asked it, like his answer mattered exactly as much today as it had yesterday. He understood slowly over the course of that meal what she was doing. She was telling him without saying it that nothing had changed, that a name on a bracelet hadn't altered what he was. To this unit hadn't made him smaller or stranger or more fragile in her eyes. That she'd simply received it the way she received everything carefully, without judgment, ready when he was ready and patient when he wasn't. It was, he thought, one of the kindest things anyone had done for him in 8 years. He didn't tell her that. He just said, try rerouting through the secondary channel instead of the primary. Should cut your latency in half. And she nodded, already working it through, and the meal continued the way meals always continued in this unit. Ordinary, unremarkable, exactly the kind of ordinary he'd learned to need more than he'd ever admitted to himself. Day 23 brought the conversation he had been circling for 3 weeks and hadn't found the nerve to start. It started the way real conversations always start, by accident. Severin had called him in to go over the week's logistics summary, ordinary work, the kind they did twice a week, now sitting across from each other at her desk, while the evening light came in low through the window. He'd brought the manifest. She'd brought her usual economy of words. And somewhere in the middle of a sentence about transport scheduling, she set her stylus down and looked at him in a way that wasn't about the manifest at all. Tessa told me, she said, not the name, just that she saw it, that you didn't explain. Corin set the folio down. She wasn't supposed to tell you that. She didn't tell me as a report, Severin said. She told me because she was worried about you, and she did not know what to do with that worry, and I am the only person in this unit she trusts with things she does not know what to do with. A pause. That is not a complaint about Tessa. That is information about what this unit has become, in case you have not noticed it yet. He hadn't, not fully, not in those terms. 8 years, she said, not a question. An opening left wide enough for him to walk through if he chose to. He looked at the bracelet where it sat half visible at the edge of his pocket, the leather worn soft from years of his own thumb. And because the room was quiet, and because the light was the particular gold it got at this hour, and because some part of him had been circling this for 23 days and was finally too tired to keep circling it alone, he told her. Her name was Rhea, he said. Combat medic. We trained together, deployed together. 8 years ago on a mission that should have been simple, and wasn't, because nothing ever is. Severin didn't move, didn't interrupt. Just listened the way she listened to everything, with her full attention, and none of the impatience he'd learned to expect from people who asked questions they didn't actually want answered. We were pulling wounded out of a forward position that was supposed to have been cleared, he said. It wasn't. Rhea went back in for someone we'd missed on the first pass. I told her to wait for backup. A pause, the kind that cost something to hold. She didn't wait. She never waited. That was who she was, the kind of person who went back in every time because someone needed her to. What happened? Severin said. Quiet. I got there 4 minutes too late, Corin said. 4 minutes. I've measured them 1,000 times since. I know exactly what I could have done differently in every one of them, and none of it would have mattered, and I still measure them anyway. The room held its silence a long moment. I left the field after that, he said. Combat medicine asked you to be fast enough every time, and I just learned I wasn't, not when it counted most. So I went into logistics, quiet work, paperwork, the kind of job where nobody bleeds out in front of you because you didn't reach them in time. Severin was quiet for a long moment, making room for what had already been said rather than searching for what to add. You did not fail her, she said finally. You don't know that. I know, Severin said, that a man who measures 4 minutes 1,000 times over 8 years is not a man who failed to care enough. He is a man who cared so completely that the failure rewrote how he understood himself. Her amber gold eyes held his steady unflinching in the way that was entirely hers. That is not the same thing as guilt earned. That is grief wearing guilt's clothes because grief alone felt too large to carry. He hadn't expected that, hadn't expected after 8 years of carrying it mostly alone for someone to look at the shape of it so plainly and name it correctly on the first try. I don't know how to put it down, he said. Quiet, almost too quiet to be heard. I am not asking you to put it down, Severin said. Some things are not meant to be put down. They are meant to be carried differently, with company instead of alone. A pause. You have spent 8 years making yourself useful so that you would never again be the reason someone needed help and didn't get it in time. That is not a flaw, Corin. That is the truest thing about you. But it does not have to be the only thing. He sat with that. Let it land the way certain sentences land, not all at once, but slowly, the way water finds its way into ground that's been dry a long time. Thank you, he said. It was all he had. Do not thank me, Severin said, and there was the faintest movement at the corner of her mouth. Finish the manifest. We have a resupply route to plan, and grief in my experience does not excuse a man from his paperwork. He almost laughed. The sound surprised him more than it surprised her. He picked the folio back up, but the weight of the bracelet against his hip had changed register, not lighter, not yet, not really, just less alone. He left her office that evening into air that felt different than it had an hour earlier, though nothing about the base had changed. Same running lights, same wind moving past the perimeter fence, same plateau dark now holding the same indifferent silence it always held. Except something in him had changed, and that was apparently enough to make the whole evening feel different around it. He walked back to Block D slowly, in no hurry, which was new for him. He was a man who moved with purpose. Always had the kind of purpose that came from years of believing that slowing down meant missing something. But tonight he let himself walk slowly. Let himself notice the particular quality of starlight on a plateau with no city glow to compete with it. Let himself think briefly about Rhea and found that the thought for the first time in 8 years didn't arrive accompanied by the 4 minutes. It just arrived as her, as the person she'd been before any of it, as the medic who'd taught him to suture faster than the field manual recommended, who'd laughed too loud at her own jokes, who'd gone back in every single time because someone needed her to. He held that version of her for a while walking under the plateau stars and found it didn't hurt quite the way it usually did. He didn't know yet whether that meant he was healing or simply too tired that night to carry the weight the way he usually carried it. He decided it didn't matter which. Either way, it was the first easy breath he'd taken thinking about her in 8 years, and he wasn't going to interrogate a gift closely enough to talk himself out of it. The next morning brought an ordinary briefing and an ordinary day of manifest review. But something in how the unit moved around him had shifted subtly in a register he couldn't quite name until mid-morning, when Aura set a second cup of the bitter Cathari tea on his workstation without being asked. "You look like you needed it," she said. Simple, already walking away before he could thank her. He sat with the cup a moment, steam curling up into the flat morning light, and understood slowly that this was what care looked like in a unit that didn't have much use for sentiment. Not grand gestures, not declarations. A second cup of tea offered without ceremony by a woman who'd noticed something in his face she didn't have words for and had chosen to act on it anyway. He drank the tea, submitted the morning's manifest, found himself somewhere in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, more steady than he'd been in longer than he could easily remember. Day 26 brought the thing nobody saw coming, least of all Drenna Voy. It started with a routine personnel review, Severin going through old service records as part of the formal inquiry into the 11-kilo discrepancy, the kind of administrative work that mostly meant reading old files and looking for patterns. Drenna had been called in to confirm a few details about her own service history before transferring to Vex Company dates and postings, nothing that should have mattered to anyone but a records clerk. She was halfway through confirming the deployment date when she stopped, went very still. "This posting," she said, tapping the slate, 6 years ago, Joint Extraction Operation Southern Border Conflict. I was wounded there, shrapnel lower leg, A field medic stabilized me before transport. I never saw his face. Mask and visor standard field protocol. I only remember the voice. Severin looked up from her own slate. Why does that matter now, she said. Because the operation designation, Drenna said slowly, matches a deployment record I just saw cross-referenced in Corin's personnel file. Combat medic certification, 8 years active, discharged after a casualty incident. She looked up. He was attached to that operation. The same week, the same sector. The room went very quiet. Corin, who had been standing near the doorway with the week's logistics summary, felt something in his chest go cold and then slowly and possibly warm. I don't remember every patient, he said careful because this felt like the kind of moment where the wrong word could break something that hadn't finished forming yet. Field triage during an extraction, you see dozens in an hour. Most of them you never learn the names of. I remember the voice, Drenna said. She wasn't looking at the slate anymore. She was looking at him, the assessment expression gone entirely replaced by something he hadn't seen on her face in 26 days. Low, steady. You kept saying the same thing over and over while you worked. Stay with me. I've got you. Stay with me. Corin felt the floor tilt slightly, the vertigo of a memory surfacing whole and unbidden after years of staying buried. He remembered that operation. Remembered the chaos of it, the noise, the visor fogging with his own breath. Remembered a Cathari soldier with a leg wound bad enough that he genuinely thought for about 90 seconds that he was going to lose her, the way he'd lost Rhea 3 months earlier. Remembered saying exactly those words because they were the only words he had left by then, the only ones that still worked. You were the one in the leg, he said slowly. Southern extraction point. 3 months after. He stopped himself before he said her name out loud before the room asked for more than he had ready to give it. 3 months after I lost someone. You were one of the first patients I treated after I went back to the field before I left it for good. Drenna was very still. You saved my leg, she said. The surgeon told me later 4 more minutes of blood loss, and I would have lost it entirely. Maybe more than that. A pause, the kind that cost her something to hold the same kind he'd recognized in himself 1,000 times. I have thought about that medic for 6 years. I never thought I would meet him standing in a logistics block arguing with me about cargo seals. Something crossed her face that he'd genuinely never seen there before. Not the assessment look, not the puzzle tilt, not even the quieter version it had softened into over the past weeks. Something open. Something that looked more than anything like the vulnerability of a person discovering that a debt they'd carried unpaid for years had just without warning found its way back to them. I owe you my leg, she said. Possibly more than that. You don't owe me anything, Corin said, quiet, immediate. That's not how it works. That's never how it's worked for me. I didn't save you so you carry a debt. I saved you because it was the only thing I knew how to do that still mattered the week I did it. Drenna held his gaze a long moment. Then I will not call it a debt, she said. I will call it something else. What? I do not know yet, she said. I have not had 6 years to think about what to call it. I have only had the last 4 minutes. The room held its quiet, the kind that follows a thing too large to immediately understand the shape of. Severin, who had watched the entire exchange without a word, finally spoke. This does not leave this room until Corin is ready for it to, she said, looking between them, her voice carrying the same flat authority it carried over everything else in this unit. Some things are not the unit's business until the person who lived them decides they are. Drenna nodded, slow still, looking at Corin with that open, unguarded expression. Understood, she said. Then quieter, thank you for 6 years ago, and for not telling me sooner that you knew. I didn't know, Corin said. Not until just now, I promise you that. I believe you, Drenna said. That is perhaps the strangest part of all of this. I believe you completely. The news, despite Severin's instruction, found its way through the unit within 2 days anyway, not because anyone broke confidence, but because some truths are too large to stay perfectly contained. And this was the kind of truth that changed the air in a room even when nobody spoke it directly. Corin noticed it first in small things. Leith, who'd barely spoken to him beyond logistics matters since the ankle incident weeks earlier, started leaving her seat at the mess table open at the end, where he usually sat, as though the unit's collective geometry had quietly rearranged itself around a fact nobody had announced. Aura, who handled equipment and rarely looked up from her inventory sheets, met his eyes one morning in the supply block and simply nodded once deliberate, the kind of nod that carried more weight than most sentences. He didn't ask anyone what they knew. He didn't need to. The unit had a way of absorbing information collectively the way water finds the lowest point in a landscape without anyone directing it there. They'd learned over 6 weeks to read him the way they read terrain, carefully, patiently building a picture from small data points until the whole shape revealed itself. And the shape they'd built now included this a man who'd saved one of their own 6 years before any of them had met him, who'd carried that fact unknowingly until it found its way back. It was Tessa who said something out loud first, 2 days after the personnel review, finding him in the comms block at the end of a long shift. Drenna told me, she said, quiet, careful the way she'd been careful about the bracelet weeks before. About the extraction. About you. I assume she might. She has not stopped thinking about it, Tessa said. I do not think she expected to ever know who the medic was. I think she had made a kind of peace with not knowing, the way you make peace with questions that seem permanently unanswerable. A pause. And now the question has an answer, and the answer is someone she has spent 6 weeks watching cross a sparring pad and argue about cargo seals. Corin sat with that. Is she all right? He asked. Tessa considered the question with her usual total attention. I think, she said slowly, that she is recalibrating something she believed about the universe. That kind of recalibration takes time. But I do not think all right is the wrong word. I think she is more all right than she has been in 6 years, even if it does not look like it yet. He found Drenna herself later that evening, alone near the equipment racks, running a maintenance check. She clearly didn't need to be running the kind of busy work people invent when their hands need something to do while their mind works through something larger. You've been avoiding me, he said, not an accusation, an observation. I have been thinking, Drenna said, not looking up from the rifle in her hands. There is a difference. What have you been thinking about? She set the rifle down, looked at him directly. I have spent 6 years being the soldier who almost lost her leg, she said. It became part of how I understood myself, a scar I carried alongside the others, evidence of a moment where I was nearly not enough. A pause. And now I learned that the moment was not only mine, that somewhere a medic carried it too differently for different reasons, but carried it nonetheless. That we have both been walking around for 6 years with the same 4 minutes living inside us, and neither of us knew the other existed. That's a strange thing to find out, Corin said. It is, Drenna agreed. I do not yet know what to do with it. You don't have to do anything with it, he said. Some things don't need doing. They just need acknowledging. The fact sits there and you let it sit, and eventually it finds its own shape in how you carry it. Drenna studied him a long moment. You sound like a man who has had a great deal of practice carrying things he could not resolve, she said. I have, he admitted. Then perhaps, she said, we have more in common than a single extraction point 6 years ago. It wasn't quite a question. He answered it like one anyway. Perhaps we do, he said. She picked the rifle back up, returned to her maintenance check, and the conversation ended there, unresolved in the way that felt right rather than incomplete. Two people who discovered an old debt didn't need to be paid back, only carried forward together the way the rest of this unit had taught him to carry things. Day 28 brought the thing that nearly undid everything they'd built. It started with a transmission Corin shouldn't have intercepted, a routine depot channel. He was monitoring for the ongoing Varan inquiry. 3 words in a logistics report that didn't belong there. Liaison reassignment recommended. His name, his posting. A formal recommendation filed that morning by someone several ranks above Varan, citing unit disruption. and irregular personnel relationships developing within an embedded auxiliary assignment. He read it twice. Then a third time the way he'd read the original deployment slip 11 weeks earlier, hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something more reasonable. They didn't. Someone, whoever sat behind Varen in this, whoever Severin had quietly suspected for the past 10 days without ever saying so directly, had found a different lever to pull. Not an accusation about the 11 kilos. Something quieter. Something that sounded on paper entirely reasonable, a civilian liaison growing too close to the unit he was meant to serve objectively at arm's length. He thought about Tessa, who'd returned his bracelet without a single question asked. He thought about Severin, who'd named his grief correctly on the first try. He thought about Drenna, 4 minutes from losing a leg 6 years ago, sitting across a table from him now. He thought about how easy it would be on paper to call all of that irregular. He took the recommendation to Severin immediately. She read it once, her jaw set in a way he hadn't seen before. Not anger, exactly, something colder and more controlled than anger. The stillness of a commander who has just understood that an old threat has found a new shape. They cannot move you without unit consent, she said. Not on a recommendation alone, but they can make it difficult. They can make the inquiry into Varen disappear into a personnel reassignment instead, and if that happens, we lose both the evidence and you. Then we don't let it happen, Corin said. Severin looked at him a long moment. No, she said, we do not. She called the unit together that night, an unusual hour for a briefing. The planning room lit by running lights instead of the natural amber of the working day. 14 women filed in quiet alert in the way they'd learned to be alert when something outside the ordinary rhythm of the base had shifted. Corin stood near the back, the recommendation folder in his hand, feeling for the first time in 28 days the old familiar instinct to make himself smaller than the room. The instinct to disappear before someone else decided to do it for him. He fought it down, stayed standing where he was. Severin laid it out plainly. The 11 kilos, the swap seal, the reluctance of depot administration to let an inquiry proceed cleanly, and now finally the recommendation that had arrived that morning, citing reasons that sounded reasonable on paper and felt to everyone standing in that room exactly as manufactured as they were. They are using the unit's regard for Corin as the justification for removing him, Severin said, calling it irregular, calling it a disruption. Her amber gold eyes moved across the room, settling briefly on each face before continuing. I want to be plain about what is actually happening. Someone with more rank than Hask Varen understands that the longer Corin stays, the closer we come to proving what Varen has been doing, and possibly who has been protecting him while he did it. The easiest way to stop that is not to silence the evidence. It is to remove the person reading it. A silence moved through the room, the dense kind, the kind that precedes a decision rather than follows one. Leith was the first to speak. He is not a disruption, she said, flat, certain. He fixed my ankle without telling me what to do with my own body. He has submitted every manifest correctly for 6 weeks straight. The only disruption I have observed is the one currently sitting in a depot administration office, writing recommendations about people he has never met. A few quiet sounds of agreement moved through the room, not loud. This unit didn't do loud, but unmistakable in their own restrained way. Aura spoke next, her voice steady. I have worked logistics in 3 units before this one, she said. I have never had a liaison who understood the actual mechanics of a depot transfer well enough to predict where the next failure point would be. If they remove him, we do not simply lose a person. We lose 11 weeks of institutional knowledge that took this unit 11 weeks of going without to properly value. Corin stood very still, listening, and felt something building in his chest. He didn't have a clean word for yet, not pride exactly, though there was some of that in it. Something closer to disbelief, the particular disorientation of hearing yourself described by people whose good opinion you'd never thought to expect, let alone earn so thoroughly that they'd stand up in a room and defend it. He thought briefly of the 9 postings before this one, of how many rooms he'd left without anyone noticing he'd gone, of how that absence of noticing had become somewhere along the way, something he'd simply learned to expect the way you learn to expect weather. This was not that. Merv, who rarely spoke unless directly asked, spoke now. I did not trust him for the first 2 weeks, she said, looking directly at Corin. Not unkindly, simply honestly, the way this unit did most things. I trust him now. That is not a small thing coming from me. I do not extend it carelessly. Tessa didn't speak right away. When she did, her voice carried a weight he hadn't heard in it before, something that went past her usual careful precision into something closer to conviction. He is the first liaison who stayed long enough for any of us to actually know him, she said. Not perform competence at him, not watch him from a careful distance, waiting to see if he would leave the way the others left. Know him, the way you know someone you have built something with. She looked at Severin. If we let him be moved on a manufactured reason, we are telling every liaison who comes after him that staying, that actually becoming part of this unit, instead of simply serving it, is dangerous. I do not think that is the lesson we want this unit to teach. Drenna spoke last. The room had a way of waiting for her, not because she demanded it, but because when Drenna finally said something, it tended to be the thing that settled whatever question the room had been circling. 6 years ago, she said, a medic I never saw the face of kept me from losing my leg during an extraction that should not have gone the way it went. I carried that debt unknowingly for 6 years, never expecting to learn who held the other end of it. She looked at Corin and the room followed her gaze. I have learned in the past 3 days that the debt has a face now, a name, a man who has spent 6 weeks proving in small, unglamorous ways that the version of himself who saved my leg was not an anomaly. It was simply who he is consistently, whether anyone is watching or not. She paused. I do not believe in coincidence enough to think it means nothing that he ended up here in this unit 11 weeks after a wrong checkbox. I believe it means something. I do not yet know what, but I am not prepared to let an administrative recommendation decide that question before we have had the chance to find out. Severin let the silence sit a moment after Drenna finished, the silence of a commander gauging whether a room had reached genuine consensus or merely the appearance of one. The vote is informal tonight, she said finally, but I want it clear and I want it unanimous if it is going to mean anything against what we are facing. Does this unit want Corin Hale to remain formally contesting the reassignment recommendation through every channel available to us? 14 hands went up. Not hesitant, not performative. Immediate the way decisions are immediate when they have already been made somewhere quieter, long before anyone asked the question out loud. Corin stood at the back of the room, the recommendation folder still in his hand, and felt something move through his chest that he hadn't felt in 8 years. Not relief exactly, something larger and more disorienting than relief. The vertigo of being wanted plainly by people who had no obligation to want him at all. He didn't trust himself to speak right away. Thank you, he said finally. It came out rougher than he meant it to. Do not thank us yet, Severin said, and there was the faintest movement at the corner of her mouth again. A unanimous vote from 14 women does not automatically defeat a recommendation filed by someone with more rank than all of us combined. It only means we are prepared to fight it properly together instead of watching you disappear the way the others disappeared. That's enough, Corin said. That's more than enough. Outside the window, the plateau was going fully dark now, the running lights of the base flickering on one by one against the falling evening. And somewhere in a depot administration office, Corin had never set foot in someone with more rank than Hask Varen was waiting to see whether a logistics officer who checked the wrong box 11 weeks ago would simply disappear the way the last 3 liaisons had. He didn't intend to disappear. Not now, not after 28 days of being seen properly for the first time in 8 years. Not after a unit of 14 women had just stood up unanimous and unhesitating and told an administrative system built on the assumption that liaisons were interchangeable, that this one at least was not. He thought of Rhea the way he'd been thinking of her differently since the conversation in Severin's office. Not as a wound he carried alone, but as someone who would have recognized exactly what was happening in this room tonight, would have understood it the way she'd understood everything, instinctively, completely. You'd have liked them, he thought, all of them. He believed for the first time in a long while that wherever she was, she might have agreed. The meeting broke quietly, the unit dispersing back to their evening routines, with the efficiency they brought to everything, as though a unanimous vote to fight an administrative system on his behalf was simply one more item of unit business handled and complete. Severin caught him at the door as he was leaving. "This will not be simple," she said. "Whoever is behind Varen will not stop because 14 women raise their hands in a planning room. They will escalate. They may escalate quickly." "I know," Corin said. "Are you prepared for that?" He thought about the question honestly, the only way he knew how to think about anything. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm prepared to find out alongside people who just told me without hesitation that they wanted me to stay. That's more than I had 11 weeks ago. I think it's enough to start with." Severin held his gaze a long moment, the amber gold steady in the low light of the corridor. "Yes," she said. "I think it is too." He walked back to Block D under a sky gone fully dark. The plateau stars sharp and uncountable overhead. And for the first time since arriving at this base, he didn't reach for the bracelet to remind himself of what he'd lost. He thought instead about what he'd found. He closed his eyes that night without the bracelet in his hand for the first time in 8 years. It sat instead on the small shelf beside his bunk, in plain sight, no longer something to hide. Part 3. The escalation never came. Not the way either of them had braced for. It took 9 days. 9 days of waiting for the next administrative move, the next manufactured recommendation, the next quiet attempt to make a problem disappear by making the person who'd found it disappear instead. Corin spent those 9 days doing exactly what he'd always done. Manifest cross-checks the unglamorous architecture of keeping a combat unit running smoothly enough that nobody upstream had to think about it. And then on the morning of day 37, a formal notice arrived from Depot administration. Brief, procedural, the kind of language that said everything by saying almost nothing at all. Reassignment recommendation withdrawn. Personnel inquiry into discrepancy reports referred to auxiliary oversight for standard review. No further action required at this time. Severin read it twice. Set it down. "That's it," Corin said. Not quite a question. "That is how these things end sometimes," Severin said. Not with a confrontation. With someone deciding quietly that the cost of continuing outweighs the cost of stopping. She looked at him. 14 unanimous votes from a combat unit are not nothing, Corin. Whoever was behind this understood that fighting a unified company was a different proposition than fighting one tired liaison who hadn't yet built anything worth defending. He felt something in his chest unclench that he hadn't fully realized was still clenched. "And Varen?" he asked. "Reassigned quietly, not punished in any way that will satisfy either of us, I suspect." A pause. "But removed from a position where he could continue doing whatever he was doing. Sometimes that has to be enough. The system does not always give you the ending you wanted. It gives you the ending that stops the harm, and you learn to let that be sufficient." Corin sat with that. It wasn't the clean resolution some part of him had wanted, no public reckoning, no moment where the person behind 11 weeks of quiet exploitation was made to answer for it in front of everyone he'd wronged. Just paperwork withdrawn quietly the way paperwork had started this whole thing 11 weeks ago. But something in him had changed enough over 37 days that he found he didn't need the clean ending as badly as he might have once. "It's enough," he said, and found to his own mild surprise that he meant it. The unit's relief showed itself the way the unit showed everything without ceremony. Leith's shoulders dropped a fraction during the morning briefing that hadn't dropped in over a week. Aura stopped double-checking the depot channel every hour for new recommendations. Tessa, who'd been quietly monitoring every formal communication in or out of the base since the vote, finally let herself stop refreshing the queue every 20 minutes. It wasn't a celebration. This unit didn't celebrate the absence of a threat the way other people might. They simply collectively exhaled and went back to the rhythm that had defined them long before Corin arrived. That night alone in Block D, Corin sat with the withdrawal notice still open on his slate. He read it a third time, then a fourth the way he'd once read the original deployment slip, hoping it might rearrange itself into something more reasonable. This time the words stayed exactly as they were, and that he realized slowly was the relief itself, not a victory announced loudly, not a confrontation won, just the quiet absence of a threat that had shadowed 37 days without ever fully announcing its shape. He thought of Rhea the way grief arrived now, not as an ambush, but as a visitor he'd learned to welcome rather than brace against. She would have found something almost funny in the anticlimax of it, the way the thing he'd half expected to become a confrontation had instead simply ended. Quietly, administratively. The way most real threats end if you're fortunate enough to have people standing beside you when they arrive. He didn't need the dramatic ending. He needed exactly what he'd gotten 14 women who'd refused to let an old wrong keep happening quietly in a system that, faced with that refusal, had simply backed down. It wasn't poetry, it was paperwork withdrawn. But it was enough. Day 42 brought something he hadn't expected, not a single dramatic moment, but an accumulation of small ones across the course of an ordinary afternoon, each arriving separately, each unannounced, each carrying more weight than its size suggested it should. Merv found him first, in the equipment block during a quiet stretch between tasks. She crossed to him with the directness she brought to everything. 6 weeks ago, she said, the Southern Approach exercise. You flagged the drainage feature before any of us reached it. She paused, and something in her steadiness opened a fraction, not softened, just widened. I told you that day what the previous liaison had done. I did not tell you what I actually thought watching you predict a hazard from elevation data in a water table reading. What did you think? I grew up on a colony where men did not stay, she said, where every man who arrived eventually decided the work was too hard, or the company too demanding, or simply that there was somewhere easier to be. I joined this company in part because it gave me distance from needing to trust men at all. A pause, the words costing her something visible. You arrived through an administrative error and stayed through 42 days of evidence that some men do not leave, that some men understand staying as a discipline rather than a default they fall into when nothing better presents itself. She held his gaze steady. I wanted you to know that I noticed, and that it changed something in how I understand what is possible. She left before he could fully respond the way she usually did, conversation complete the moment its purpose was served. He stood in the equipment block a moment longer than the moment required turning that over. Aura found him an hour later setting a small data chip beside his folio without comment. What's this, he asked. The depot filing taxonomy fix, she said. The one you flagged in your second week. I implemented the remaining structural corrections myself using your notes as the framework. It has cut processing errors across 3 units by half. Something almost shy crossed her usually steady expression. You did the hard part. I only finished what you started. That's not how I'd put it. I know, Aura said. That is precisely why I am the one saying it instead of you. By evening, it had become something he could no longer mistake for coincidence. Leith found him at the mess table before the meal began, sitting down across from him with a directness that didn't ask permission. I never thanked you properly, she said, for the ankle, the first week. You don't owe me thanks for field assessment. That's the job. It is not only about the assessment, Leith said. The previous liaison, when Drenna sprained her wrist months before you arrived, told her to report to medical and take a rest week. He made the decision for her as though her own judgment about her body did not factor into it. She held his gaze. You knelt down, looked at my ankle, and then asked me what I wanted to do about it. You gave me the information and let me decide. I do not think you understood in that moment how rare that was, how rare it still is. I just didn't think it was my decision to make. That is precisely my point, Leith said. You did not think it was your decision. Many people in your position would have. A pause, something almost soft, crossing her usually composed expression. Thank you for trusting me with my own body. It mattered more than I let myself say at the time. She left it there complete, unembellished, exactly as much as needed and not a word more. Tessa sat across from him, later settling in with her tray and saying without ceremony that the bracelet conversation 6 weeks earlier had taught her something about patience she hadn't fully understood until she'd practiced it herself. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Some lessons name themselves sufficiently in a single sentence. Drenna didn't say anything at all, just sat beside him for the length of the meal present in a way that had become its own kind of language between them. The language of two people who'd both carried something too long alone and had recently cautiously begun learning to carry it differently. It wasn't a planned thing. Nobody had organized this. No one had decided that today would be the day the unit told him one by one in their own unceremonious ways exactly what 6 weeks had meant to them. It had simply arrived the way the most honest things arrive, unplanned, accumulated, true. He found Severin afterward in the planning room, the evening light doing the thing it always did at this hour, warm and low, and edged with something almost gold. "Did you arrange that?" he asked. "No," Severin said. "I did not need to. The unit has been carrying what you mean to them for some time now. Today simply happened to be the day several of them decided independently that carrying it silently no longer made sense." She studied him a moment. "You look unsettled." "I'm not used to it," he admitted. "Being thanked properly, not for completing a task, for being—" He stopped searching for the word. "Present," Severin offered. "Consistently, without performance." "Yes. Get used to it," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved in the way he'd come to recognize. "This unit does not extend that kind of regard carelessly. If they are extending it to you, it is because you have earned it in the only currency this company has ever respected. Time, consistency, showing up the same way every day, whether anyone is watching or not." He thought of Rhea not as a wound, but as a presence woven into how he understood himself rather than separate from it. She would have recognized this unit immediately, would have called them her kind of people the way she'd called every fellow medic and soldier who went back in when the easier choice was to wait. He thought, standing there in the evening light of the planning room with Severin's words still settling around him, that he finally understood what she'd been to him beyond the grief. Not just the person he'd lost, the person who'd shown him by going back in every time what it looked like to commit fully to the people in front of you. He'd spent 8 years trying to honor that by being fast enough, thorough enough, by never letting another number slip past him in a manifest or a retrieval report. But this unit had shown him something Rhea had perhaps always been trying to show him too, something he hadn't been ready to receive until now, that the most important form of presence wasn't about being fast enough. It was about staying long enough. Showing up the same way on day 42 as you had on day 1, not because someone was watching, but because that was simply who you were. He thought she would have approved of that interpretation. He thought she would have told him so at some volume with her characteristic total lack of reserve, and then made him explain his manifest filing system in exhaustive detail, because that was also who she was, and the thought arrived for the first time not as a wound reopening, but as warmth. He left the planning room that evening into air that still carried the last of the day's amber light, and somewhere in the walk back to Block D, he understood that he had stopped measuring the 4 minutes, not forgotten them, not resolved them into something clean and painless, simply stopped needing to measure them the way you stop checking a lock after you've lived in a house long enough to know the door is solid. The days between 42 and 50 passed in the rhythm Corin had come to recognize as the unit's version of contentment. Not loud, never loud, but steady in a way that felt increasingly like something he could rely on rather than something he needed to keep proving he deserved. He spent an afternoon teaching Tessa a deeper layer of the depot coordination system, the kind of institutional knowledge most liaisons guarded jealously because it made them harder to replace. He didn't guard it, handed it over freely. "You're not worried this makes you unnecessary?" Tessa asked, watching him walk her through a workflow he'd built from 9 years of accumulated shortcuts. If teaching you everything I know makes me unnecessary, he said, then I was never necessary in the first place. I was just hard to replace. Those aren't the same thing. He looked at her. I'd rather be valuable because of who I am here, not because I'm hoarding information nobody else has access to. Tessa considered that with her usual total attention. That is a generous way to understand your own worth, she said. Maybe, Corin said, or maybe it's just the only way that doesn't eventually make you bitter watching everyone you taught move past the thing you were holding on to. She didn't have a response to that immediately. He noticed it, held the silence a moment longer than usual, and let it sit there the way he'd learned to let most things sit when she wasn't ready to offer more. He spent one quiet evening with Drenna that neither of them planned, both ending up at the same maintenance station at the same hour, by simple coincidence working in companionable silence on separate tasks that didn't require conversation to feel complete. You seem different, Drenna said eventually, not looking up from the rifle she was cleaning. Since the inquiry closed. Lighter, he admitted. I didn't realize how much weight I was carrying waiting for the other administrative shoe to drop. And now I think I finally believe it's actually over, he said, which is its own kind of strange. I'm not entirely sure what to do with the space that opens up once you stop bracing for something. Drenna looked up at that. I have wondered the same thing, she said. Since I learned who you were, I spent 6 years bracing for nothing in particular, just carrying an unanswered question, the way you carry a stone in your boot. You've stopped noticing because the discomfort became familiar. Now the question has an answer, and I find myself with the same strange space you describe. What have you done with it? She considered the question seriously. I have started sitting beside you at meals, she said. I have found that the space, once I stopped filling it with the old question, made room for something else instead. I am still deciding what to call that something else, but I do not think I mind the uncertainty as much as I once would have. He nodded, and the two of them returned to their separate tasks. The silence between them comfortable rather than empty, exactly the kind of quiet he'd learned over 50 days to recognize as its own form of belonging. Day 50 brought the formal ceremony, though it began true to the unit's nature without anyone calling it that. It started as an ordinary Thursday briefing. Severin opened with the week's logistics summary, same as always, and Corin stood at his now customary place near the front of the room instead of the back. A small shift in geography that had happened so gradually over 50 days that he'd stopped noticing it as a shift at all. Then Severin set down her slate. Before we move to operational matters, she said, there is unit business that requires formal acknowledgement. The room's attention sharpened, though nobody seemed surprised, which told him immediately that whatever was coming had been discussed and agreed upon long before this morning in conversations he hadn't been party to. 50 days ago, Severin said Vex Company received a liaison through administrative error. We have in that time weathered an attempt to exploit an 11-week gap in our oversight, a manufactured recommendation designed to remove the one person capable of closing that gap and the ordinary friction of integrating a civilian into a unit that has historically struggled to integrate anyone at all. She looked around the room, slow, deliberate. We have also, in that same 50 days, gained something this unit has not had since its formation. Not simply competent logistics support, though that alone would have been valuable. We have gained a member of this company who understands in his bones the particular discipline of showing up consistently for people who have not yet decided to trust him and continuing to show up long after they have. Her amber gold eyes found Corin directly. The unit voted unanimously 6 weeks ago to contest your reassignment. I want it formally recorded today that the same unanimous sentiment extends further than simply wanting you to stay. She paused. Vex Company requests formally and permanently that you accept the embedded liaison designation, not as a 4-week rotation, not as a transactional civilian-grade relationship the Commonwealth structure was built around. Permanently, as a member of this company in every sense the word carries. The room held its silence, the kind that precedes something neither side wants to rush. Corin felt the weight of 14 sets of eyes in Severin's and found that for the first time in 50 days, the attention didn't feel like assessment anymore. It felt like welcome. "I accept," he said. It came out steadier than he expected. A few quiet sounds of approval moved through the room. Not loud, this unit didn't do loud, but unmistakable warm in their own restrained way. Severin nodded once, satisfied. Then she reached into the small case beside her slate and withdrew an object he didn't immediately recognize. A service pin, old, the metal worn soft at the edges, the way only decades of handling could wear metal. "This belonged to Commander Yara Thess," she said, and her voice for the first time in 50 days carried something he hadn't heard in it before. Something unguarded. "She founded this company. She led it for 11 years through campaigns I will not detail here, and she did not survive the last of them." A pause, the kind that cost her visibly to hold. "I inherited her command, and with it, the grief of leading a unit built by someone I could never fully replace. I have spent 4 years being careful, exacting, deliberately withholding warmth I was afraid would make me seem less capable of holding this company together the way she did." The room was utterly still. Corin understood, watching her, that he was witnessing something the unit itself had perhaps never fully heard spoken aloud. "I did not soften with any of you for 4 years," Severin continued, "not because I did not care, because I believed wrongly that caring visibly would make me weaker as your commander. Watching a logistics officer with the wrong checkbox spend 50 days demonstrating that strength and warmth are not opposites, that the most disciplined thing a person can do is show up consistently and let themselves be known while doing it, has taught me something I should have learned 4 years ago." She looked around the room at Drenalith, Merv, the others who had served under her since the company's founding. "I owe this unit an apology I should have offered years ago," she said. "Not for being exacting. Exacting kept us alive. But for believing that exacting and warm could not coexist in the same commander. I watched a civilian liaison prove me wrong in 50 days. I am sorry it took someone outside this company to teach me what I should have already understood about leading inside it." Drenna was the one who spoke first into the silence that followed. "Commander Thess would not have wanted an apology," she said, her voice carrying something raw he hadn't heard from her before. "She would have wanted exactly what is happening in this room right now. You finally letting us see you the way she always let herself be seen." A pause, her composure visibly costing her something to hold. "I have missed her for 4 years without permitting myself to say so, because grief felt like something this unit did not have room for. Watching you say her name today plainly without flinching, that is its own gift, Commander. Perhaps the larger one." Leith nodded beside her, something unguarded moving across her usually composed face. "We have all been carrying her a little differently," she said. "Quietly, separately. I did not realize until this moment how much I needed to carry her together with the rest of you instead." Severin held the room's gaze a long moment, something settling in her expression. The relief of a person setting down a weight they hadn't realized, until the moment of setting it down, how heavy it had become. "Then let us carry her together going forward," she said. "Starting today." She turned back to Corin, the pin still resting in her open palm. "Commander Thess wore this not as rank," she said. "As a reminder, she told me once that a company is only as strong as its willingness to actually see one another beyond duty, beyond performance. I am giving it to you not because you are replacing her. No one replaces her. But because you have in 50 days embodied the principle she spent 11 years trying to build into this unit, and I think she would have wanted it carried forward by someone who understood it instinctively rather than someone who had to be taught." Corin took the pin. It sat heavier in his palm than its size suggested it should. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "You do not need to say anything," Severin said. "You only need to keep doing what you have already been doing. That has always been enough." He looked at the pin worn soft at the edges and thought of the bracelet that now sat openly on the shelf beside his bunk instead of hidden in a pocket. Thought of Rhea, who would have understood this unit's language of care immediately, who had spent her own short life embodying exactly the principles Severin had just described. He thought for the first time in 8 years that he had found a place where carrying both the grief and the gift that had grown up alongside it didn't require choosing one over the other. That evening, the mess table held a different quality than it usually did. Still unceremonious, still ordinary in the unit's fashion, but warmer the gap at the end of the table now permanently closed, filled not by accident, but by the deliberate daily choice of 14 women who had decided individually and then collectively that this was where he belonged. Tessa sat beside him as she often did now. "I have a question," she said. "Not about work." "Go ahead." "When you arrived," she said, "you told me that you focus on the problem in front of you, that it was not a strategy, just how you were built." She considered her next words carefully. "I do not think that is entirely true anymore. I think somewhere in the last 50 days, focusing on the problem in front of you became something else. Something more like choosing every day to be present for the people in front of you instead of only the tasks." He thought about that. "You might be right," he said. "I am usually right," Tessa said without arrogance, simply stating an observed pattern the way she stated most things. "It is one of my more reliable qualities." He laughed properly, the sound surprising him, the way genuine laughter does when you've been too long without it. Drenna across the table looked up at the sound with something unguarded in her expression that had become over the past several weeks considerably less rare. "6 years ago," she said apropos of nothing and everything at once, "I did not know the name of the medic who saved my leg. I have spent 6 years grateful to a stranger I would never meet." She held his gaze. "I find I am considerably more grateful now that the stranger has a name and a place at this table, and 50 days of proof that the man who saved me was not an anomaly. He is simply who he has always been." "That's a generous way to put it," Corin said. "It is an accurate way to put it," Drenna said. "I am not in the habit of generosity that is not also accurate." The meal continued, ordinary, warm, exactly the kind of unremarkable he had learned over 50 days to need more than he had ever admitted needing anything. Day 53, midnight on the supply platform. Corin Hale sits on an upturned crate, the same one, or one exactly like it, the same platform where this story opened, and the same amber light dimmed low across the hangar ceiling. And in his hand there's a bracelet, worn leather, a name etched into the clasp. But something is different from the night this story showed him the first time. In his other hand, resting warm against his palm, is a service pin worn soft at the edges from 40 years of someone else's handling. Two names, two weights, neither of them asking him to choose. He doesn't say Rhea's name out loud. He doesn't need to, not the way he used to need to, not the gripping kind of need. She's here the way she's been here for 8 years, except now she has company, not in place of grief, but alongside it. The way Severin said it was possible to carry things the way this entire company had spent 50 days proving was true. Footsteps. He doesn't turn. He knows the stride he's learned each of them over 50 days, the way you learn the floors of a house you've stopped just passing through. Drenna sits down on the crate beside him without asking, the way she does most things now. "You are thinking about her," she said, not a question. "Always a little," he admitted. "It doesn't go away. I don't think it's supposed to." "No," Drenna agreed. "I do not think grief is meant to disappear. I think it is meant to find better company." She looked out at the dark plateau, the stars sharp overhead. "Perhaps that is what this company gave you. Not an absence of what you lost. A presence large enough to stand alongside it." He sat with that, found it exactly right in the way only the truest things feel exactly right. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think that's it precisely." More footsteps, lighter, quicker. Tessa crossing the platform with the unhurried purpose she brought to most things. A second mug of the bitter Cathari tea in each hand. She held one out to him, then sat on the crate's other side, without waiting for permission, the gap between them having long since stopped requiring an invitation to close. I saw the light still on, she said. Thought you might want company that wasn't only the wind. I appreciate it. She sipped her own tea, looking out at the same dark plateau Drenna had been watching the same uncountable stars. I keep thinking about the form, Tessa said eventually. The two columns, column A, column B. One checkbox 53 days ago, and an entire life rearranged itself around it. She looked at him. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you checked correctly? I used to, he said. In the first few weeks, I don't anymore. Why not? Because wondering about it assumes the wrong checkbox was a mistake that needed correcting, he said. And I've stopped believing that's what it was. Some part of me distracted, grieving half present, the way I'd been for 8 years, landed exactly where it needed to land, even if I didn't understand that at the time. I don't think I have the right to call that an error anymore. Not after everything it led me to. Tessa was quiet a moment. That is a generous way to understand an accident, she said. Maybe, Corin said. Or maybe some accidents are just instructions we haven't learned to read correctly yet. A third set of footsteps arrived last, unhurried, deliberate. Severin, in the low amber light, the evening having finally released her from whatever final task had kept her at her desk past the hour everyone else had drifted toward sleep. She stood at the edge of the platform a moment, looking at the three of them gathered together under the indifferent stars, and something in her expression settled into something that looked for the first time in however long it had taken her to stop performing the distance like peace. I did not expect to find a gathering out here, she said. Neither did we, Drenna said. It assembled itself, the way most good things in this company seem to. Severin crossed the platform and sat close enough to be part of the circle the three of them had formed without planning to form one. 53 days, she said, looking at Corin. I have commanded this company for 4 years, and I do not believe I have once sat on this platform at midnight simply because I wanted to, rather than because some task required it. What changed? Corin asked. Severin looked out at the plateau, the stars, the dark shape of the rock shelf against a sky gone fully black. You did, she said. Not by trying to change anything, simply by demonstrating every day for 53 days that showing up consistently and letting yourself be known were never separate disciplines. That the most capable people in a room are often the ones who have stopped performing capability and started simply living it. She looked at him steadily. I have spent 4 years believing those two things required separate parts of myself. You taught this entire company, myself included, that they were always meant to be the same part. The four of them sat together in the comfortable quiet that had become over 53 days. The company's truest language, not words exactly, though words moved through it freely enough when they were needed. But presence, sustained, undemanding. The kind of company that didn't require performance to feel complete. Above them, the plateau stars held their indifferent constant watch, the same as they had on his first night here, the same as they would on every night that followed. The wind kept moving through the dry grass. The base lights kept their steady amber hum. And Corin Hale, formerly of 9 Forgettable Postings, formerly a man who measured 4 minutes 1,000 different ways alone in the dark, sat on a supply crate with a bracelet in one hand and a service pin in the other, surrounded by 3 women who had each in their own unceremonious way taught him that grief and belonging were never meant to be opposites. The truest homes he understood now were not the ones where you set down what you carried. They were the ones where you finally had company carrying it alongside you. He had checked the wrong box on a form 53 days ago, and everything had rearranged itself around it. He thought of the cold open, a man alone on a crate at midnight, a bracelet in his hand, the weight of 8 years pressing down on him in silence. He understood now that the story had never really been about that man alone. It had always been about who eventually sat down beside him. End.